My name's Justin. I work at Netflix. I specifically work on an engineering tools team, as most of you probably do. We are part of about a 13-person organization, specifically about making developing palatable. We haven't really got the term developer productivity just yet. That hasn't been our focus per se. We think of things a little bit differently at Netflix. It's usually a value proposition that we make to the developers. They don't have to use our tools whatsoever. We are not the people you have to use or get our approval or anything like that. So it's constantly a battle of us writing something better than whatever else is out there. So we haven't taken on that title just yet. The freedom responsibility comes up a lot. I'm just going to avoid it because it does take a lot of time, but it is really exciting. You can go read the Netflix culture deck or listen to one of the recent podcasts. The Ship Show podcast has an interview with us where we talk about it. Or talk to me later about it. In engineering tools, we have a lot of tools in our toolbox. As you can imagine, there's a lot of pieces. Specifically, my manager and a bunch of people on our team are actually in Sandusky, Ohio at CodeMash, giving a training on how you use all our tools. So a lot of them are in the open source. It's also -10 there, so I'm very happy I ended up coming here. But I chose one specifically that would act a little bit of a, I don't know, early or I guess late Christmas present for everybody. Let me get a quick show of hands here. Who uses Jenkins? That's a good show of hands right there. Also, given the time period, it's good to pick one thing that you guys can walk away with and play with when you leave here and stuff. And before I get into it, I just wanted to sort of mention Kirkpatrick, who works on our team, who uses the Job DSL. While I write it, he uses it and integrates into Teams, right? If people don't use it, it's useless. So I'm happy to have users. As you can imagine, things get a little out of control in Jenkins. Specifically at Netflix, we have a service-oriented architecture, lots of little services, and that freedom responsibility plays in where we sort of have every team responsible in the end for getting a service up in prod. And how they get it there is not really our concern. We hope they use our tools, we hope they use our languages, but if they don't, that's fine. But it means that they write their own jobs, they do their own releases. We're not part of any of that stuff. There's no one monolithic web app or one workflow that gets everything out there. Every team has their own flow. Now, we have some canonical jobs that they copy, but they're copies, and they get out of date, as you can imagine. And it works initially, but it gets out of date. And that's sort of our problem, because our problem is also to run Jenkins. And so we want to promote some best practices, curate Jenkins so it doesn't get out of control. And so we were sort of looking for help with that. For us, we have a mega master where we put all the plugins and all the jobs sort of run there. And we find all sorts of concurrency bugs in Jenkins all the time. It's not a good place to be. And we'll try and get away from there someday. But it means we have lots of plugins. So if you go to a configure screen, all those plugins are populating the screen. It takes a long time to load, and that's no fun for everyone. And as anyone can imagine, trying to mimic another team's Jenkins jobs. If it was one job, okay, maybe you know to hit the advanced button and copy all the advanced button fields or something like that. But once you get to 3, 4, 5 jobs, it gets out of control. And in our case, every team's going to have, let's say, 10 jobs for their flow. And that flow is going to be per branch, it's going to be per environment, and it blows out of control really fast. So we needed an alternative to this. And when we started looking, there wasn't too much. Now, we did look. I mean, I'll be the first person to admit that I'm quite lazy looking at Jenkins plugins. There's a million of them out there. You never know which ones are good, which ones are bad. If they don't have lots of screenshots, I'm not likely to use it. But in this case, we did look high and low because I didn't want to have to write it. And I could talk more about any one of the alternatives afterwards. I just want to use my time wisely. But for us, we just thought about things differently than every one of these plugins. You know, when we write our code is code, obviously. In general, we're an Ant and Gradle shop, and that's all code. And if we're going to be doing any of the infrastructure work, maybe it's Chef or Puppet, that's all code. And then we got this thing right in the middle that pulls it all together called Jenkins, that we are not writing code to make our jobs. And to us, that was a big hole. So we really thought that jobs should be artifacts like anything else. There should be another source of truth. They should be responsible citizens. There's no reason your Jenkins jobs can't sit in source control and get code reviewed and have release cycles against it and stuff. And so approaching it just like that was sort of not an easy place to start. To get from there to here was not straightforward. I had the luck of being in Colorado, the Java Posse Roundup with Hans Doctor, creator of Gradle, and Andrew Baer, who's here. He was there too. And so we had a bunch of good people who knew about these things, and we sort of came up with the Job DSL. It's very easy to use, and I'll get into the details in the code, but it pretty much starts as a build step. I mean, this screen should look familiar to people. Take a freeform job, you add a build step called process DSL. You put in the DSL you want to use, and it could be from the workspace that you have, or the other box here is to put into a text box, and you put your code in there. When the job runs, this job will create other jobs. So we call this a seed job, and things grow out of it. In this case, there's the Edge team for us. They started doing adoption, and they chose to put it into a Git repo and check it out from Git. We then run it here, and then they get, 12 jobs? And the jobs should look familiar to people. I mean, you guys should all understand why you might have a smoke test job or a nightly test job or anything like that. This is all generated out of one DSL script, of which another team can just copy and start editing the code. Or if they get really good, they start putting into useful functions that are reusable, and it just feels like code. And that's where we're trying to go here. The language itself is Groovy, which fits the Jenkins ecosystem and the Jenkins runtime pretty well, and also turned out to be pretty easy to write DSLs. And that was sort of its, I'd say, advantage. There's really just one method called job, and when you call this then creates the job. It's up to you to call it multiple times. Our goal is to mimic the constructs that are in Jenkins. So as you read a DSL job, these things look like the configure page. So when we get into it, you will see steps, and that is build steps. If you see publishers, that's the thing at the bottom of the configure page. If you see wrappers, that's the thing at the beginning. And it sort of reads like the configure page. We have pretty good coverage. So what we're doing under the covers is generating the XML that would be the config XML for the job. It's not rocket science making XML, but making it align with every plugin in all of Jenkins across every version. That starts to get a little bit more difficult. But we found there is sort of a lowest common denominator across our projects and other projects online. And we've already captured probably about 7 SCMs. So we got all the big ones covered. We have 6 triggers and 15 build steps. I have to just look at my notes here. 28 publishers and 20 wrappers. And you can imagine this is all the common pieces that you might need. One very useful part of the DSL is that we're just generating XML. So we give you a hook to generating whatever XML you want. So if it's not in the core plugin and you need to generate it, you just look at the XML and you sort of translate it to Groovy node objects. And there's sort of a smooth transition between them. We find ourselves doing it all the time. I mean, it's much easier to test out a new plugin, run it for a little while. If it looks good, we'll pull it back into the core plugin once it works and stuff. So there's nothing saying that this can't make any job that you already have in your Jenkins. There's plenty of documentation for it, but obviously you guys want to see code. And I don't know how well you can see it. I'll talk you through a few of these top to bottom. Behind the scenes, this is actually a job function. If you know Groovy, if the last parameter is a closure, you don't need the parentheses, the params, I should say, sorry. But it sort of reads like a job, right? We set a name, we set up SCM. If you have multiple SCMs, you can put them in there. You can see that there are some build steps in here of which you could just keep listing them over and over again. So these just become method calls. In this case, we made a Gradle method call. This just knows how to call Gradle. Under the covers here, there's many other arguments if you want to customize more or change certain settings and stuff. But general case, we're trying to make the easy, which is sort of one of the tenets of our teams, making the easy and making the hard possible. And in this case, you guys sort of know what's going on here. This is not hard to read. But you're not just making jobs that do this. You're making jobs that do more like this. So this is an example where we call it GitHub API. We take the results, we slurp it up, we loop over it. So what we're grabbing every Git branch, and for each iteration of loop, we're going to call the job method here, set up source control to wherever we came from, the branch name too, and run Maven. So this little tidbit, which you can copy and paste and run, will build every branch from a GitHub repo. And there's nothing stopping you from wrapping this in another call that says, give me all the repos for my GitHub account or my org or something like that. this scenario, this is a case where we like to see every branch get its own job. I think there's many cases in Jenkins where people reuse the same job over and over and over again just because it is, honestly, it's probably because it's so hard to make lots of jobs. So what we like to see is a consistent build history. If I'm looking at build 2, 3, 4, 5, I know it's the same branch and same history. If it breaks, I know what branch it came from. The test results are consistent. So we do prefer the multiple jobs. But when I've talked to other Jenkins people, I've actually got, not resistance, but like if you look at how the Git plugin works, it wants to build all branches. So there's the little rubbing heads in there, but it's very easy to get right past that and get into the flow that you want. I should talk about the disadvantages. It is a new language. I mean, we've had some Ruby shops come into the project. They've never touched Groovy, but they see the value in it, and so they learn a little bit of Groovy. You know, in that code sample, the simple stuff is pretty much DSL specific, and so you have to learn that anyway, whatever language you're coming from. And as far as the looping constructs, we're really just talking about for loops and stuff like that. Nothing too fancy as far as Groovy goes and stuff. So we haven't really found it a barrier to entry, and the people who come onto the mailing list are just so eager to get it working that they'll work through it. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Setting up a job that, if you were to print out, was this big, does take a little while to get going. So I recommend you just start small. Just set up source control, a few build steps, and work up to it. I find once you have a seed job, or running a script, and you just add a few lines, you can build up your jobs. So just don't let it be daunting if you do dive into the job DSL. I mentioned earlier that we don't have all the plugins just yet, but they're very easy to add, and I can easily say there's a new pull request for new plugins every other day at this point. So, and we've seen it coming from all over the world, all different companies, different kinds of PHP shops and Ruby shops and Java shops. We've kept the testing high and set a good standard, so we find it pretty easy. Our long-term goal, actually, if you're in the Jenkins community, would be to actually push these DSLs out to the plugins. The plugins know how to make the XML better than I can. So we'd like to get there. And it's sort of a goal that we wanted to get to. But now that we have the basics down and stuff, I think the project will get there. But other problems, I'd say not too many more. The project itself, I just found interesting. It's one of my bigger open source projects that I've worked on. And I think, like any project, if you have lots of users, you're more likely to use it. So it's worth mentioning that there's 559 installs /check. So that's up there. It's got a pretty nice curve to it. Likewise, there's an active Google group. There's a comment or question every single day. And I've just been busy the last month, and I haven't really commented, but other people have. At this point, there's 4 core contributors. Except for myself, the other 3 are outside of Netflix, and all 3 of them are actually in Europe. So we have good time zone difference, as well as coverage and stuff. So the product seems to be getting traction on its own. And what we've experimented with, which I found really interesting, is a Google Hangout. We try and do it every month. Sometimes we have an agenda, sometimes we don't. Sometimes it's for developers, sometimes it's for just new people who go, what is this job DSL thing? So if you leave here and you don't have an opportunity to catch me and you want to ask a question, get in the Google group, join the Hangout, and just ask whatever question. It's a really good format. I think I'd recommend it to any other open source projects out there, especially if it's small, but getting FaceTime with a core contributor goes a long way for people adopting your project. Just to make sure that you see the value in this, there's some use cases. We obviously have hundreds and hundreds of projects, actually thousands of Jenkins jobs at this point, so it's obvious for us. But even for smaller teams, one of the early people who saw the value in it was James Levinson from O-Power. I don't know if he's here, but it is a local San Francisco company. He wasn't a Java guy, but he really wanted to generate stuff. So he wrote a Ruby app. Developers go in, they say, here's my app, here's the workflow I want. He's got like 4 workflows, and they hit go, it gets saved to a database. His job goes in, queries that API and just says, what are the jobs, what are the flows, and he calculates everything else and just creates like 600, 700, I think last time I checked, 800 jobs out of it. And a developer just went in and said, I want this kind of job, here's my source control, go. And they're done. And what he's done is push the source of truth of what is a project and what is a common use workflow to this Ruby app and the DSL methods. The developers don't have to know anything about it. So I think it's pretty reasonable to say that developers don't have to be writing this DSL. There's lots of opportunities and people in this room who can write it for other people. So it's a really good thing to leverage for yourself if you're helping other teams. And I think this is also an interesting thing. He gave me a code snippet that hopefully reads top to bottom what he's doing, right? He's making a Maven job, he set a label, he's setting source control, goals, triggers, publishers. Maybe some of the arguments are maybe a little hard to understand here. You might have to go to docs, but I think you get the top to bottom and there's nothing hidden in an advanced box, which is really, I'd say, my goal. Another early adopter was Alan Beal. He recognized that it's really great at making jobs, right? All we can do is do what you do in that configure page, right? We can't do anything more than that. We've had people come to the project and think that we can do magic and string all these jobs together and this one flows to this one, and that's just not how Jenkins works. There are plugins that help you with it. So Alan has some really good examples where he used the build flow DSL to chain jobs together and he uses the job DSL to make the jobs. So he's sort of codified his workflow and his jobs. And honestly, we haven't even got to that point yet. That's a goal of ours to use the build flow DSL more. I think we have a little bit of time, so I'll get to some more advanced topics. For us, we know what common jobs are. At Netflix, we know what people are going to want to do. So what we do is we actually put this into a jar, and it gets versioned, and it gets released, and it gets shared, and people can pin back to it. So if you've created a merge job from us yesterday, it's still going to be the same unless we release a new version and you've chosen to upgrade. We found that pretty powerful. It also puts us in control of how these jobs get created. So in this example, we're creating merge jobs. So in the case of Netflix, we're primarily a per-for shop with Git coming in. And in our workflow, we usually clobber from dev and up to our stabilization branch, and from our stabilization branch up to prod, and then from prod down to stabilization down to dev. So 4 jobs. They all look the same, and we change it, and people constantly get out of date. So these lines here for us turn into these 8 jobs, of which when we push out a change to those jobs, these guys get it, they don't care, and we're all happy. So it really has been successful for us. Probably not as relevant as these are objects that you can manipulate and pass around. So we have scripts where one guy will create the job, but this guy adds the ant build step, and this guy adds a publisher to it. And you can build up these jobs a little incrementally. So another angle on this. And I'll try and stay within my time frame today, but just mention that there are some more advanced ways of using it and stuff. And if you think of a use case that we aren't covering, tell the Google group. We'd be happy to hear about it and stuff. If you do get into it, I just highly recommend you put these into source control. That's one thing. It's very easy to get into the habit of getting to that text box and you start editing, and maybe someday you lose it. So check into source control. Keep your C job always running. So we get this, the one bad habit people get into is they love the job and then they start manually editing it, and then the job comes back and overwrites it, right? We consider the C job the source of truth that's going to overwrite the job. So it's a really nice sledgehammer to prevent people from doing it. I mean, you could play with your job, muck it up, but make sure you go back to the DSL and update it. That's the one thing you might to see. I talked about some of the future pieces of it. I mean, we would like someday and this was the original goal of the DSL, is that you could be coming from a build, a Maven build or a Gradle build that you just clone from GitHub, and say, create me Jenkins jobs. There's no reason that he couldn't push it up. There's permission issues and other issues that crop up, but that's one of our goals still to get in there. It works great internally, but for our open source project, we love people to just clone our project and get our setup, the setup that does Gradle right and does, archives unit tests correctly and all that kind of stuff. So that's sort of something we're thinking. As you might have guessed, we're just not your normal Jenkins shop. Thousands of jobs. We had a whole big deadlock just last night. We can push it over. So we're looking for intelligent developers to come and focus on Jenkins full time and even contribute back to the community and stuff. So that's sort of we're hiring ploy and stuff. So if you like Jenkins and you want to do this in the open and stuff, this is the kind of stuff that we're working on, and we're happy to do it in the open and stuff. I think I have a few minutes for 1 or 2 questions right up front. The question is, how do we prevent developers from DOSing our Jenkins master? We don't. We trust them not to. We tell them don't do that, so they don't. I mean, it comes up and we ping them and say, hey, do you know you're doing this? And 90% of the time, they just don't know they're doing it. They set up a ***** cron job on something. And generally don't. Our goal, though, would be to actually shard out our masters and just say, hey guys, you're hitting our master too much, get your own, and leave it to them. And we'd help them with the automation and keeping it up and stuff, but we'd hope they would own it. And so if they ran out of space, they know it because they are saving 3 gig binaries or something like that. One more question? The question is if we have an existing utility to convert existing jobs. The answer is no. It's on the roadmap. We have a proposal of how we would do it. It's not impossible. We just need someone to spend a couple of hours on it. The real key is when we start wrapping this into actual plugins, they will know how to generate the proper DSL for the XML in that job. So we really need the plugins to help us with that and stuff. But we can get there. There's nothing to say we can't. And it's the biggest headache, I'd say, is when you're looking at this config XML, it looks beautiful, and you just want it over here. And it is a one-to-one translation, so there's no reason we can't. I think I'll cut it there, and that's it. Thank you very much.